The following video is sponsored by Cotner Funeral Home. Last week on This is Reynoldsburg, we began talking to Mark Myers and Connie Parkinson about the Underground Railroad. After defining the trail in a general sense, the two were able to elaborate on how it related to Reynoldsburg in particular. Local historians Mark Myers and Connie Parkinson begin to explain how we know Reynoldsburg was a part of the Underground Railroad. They also explain some of the landmarks relevant to the Underground Railroad that are still intact today.
How do we know that Reynoldsburg was a part of this secret route for the slaves to make their way up north? Well, Wilbur Siebert, correct, wrote that history.
Yeah.
Number one.
He was a professor at Ohio State University, and he wrote 2 books on slavery, and he mentioned that the route began on what was in Columbus and came to Reynoldsburg and then went up toward Utica, Mount Vernon, all that. And that was the route that Ben Patterson often took. He took the slaves to Utica, which was nearly a night's journey. He took the slaves to Mount Vernon, which was even longer. I believe that the ark, which is shown here, was covered because he used it not only to haul slaves, and there were seats along the sides, on the inside. He used it not only to haul slaves, but to haul his family and his family servants to church on Sundays and any other time that they had services.
And we have other writers who have given us a record that shows Reynoldsburg was a part of this Underground Railroad. For example, Fay May, who was a columnist back in the 30s here, wrote a column every week in the newspapers. Connie knows him very well. He mentions that he knew people who were conductors on the Underground Railroad here in town. We've got, for example, a memoir from Mary Durant, whom Connie knew, that I would like to read to you when we get down to talk more about the Ark and Alexander Livingston, where she describes her grandfather, Ben Patterson, who was the conductor here in town for Alexander Livingston, transporting the slaves up north. So we have writings here that make Reynoldsburg a center of the Underground Railroad. Now, there were many places in central Ohio that had so-called safe houses, places where the slaves could be hid during the day. In fact, there's about 20 of them around central Ohio. And we've got several out here, out towards Reynoldsburg way. So we know in general why Reynoldsburg was chosen. We have proof that it actually did happen here. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit here.
So we've proved the existence of several safe houses and conductors in Reynoldsburg. We know that there were such people living in Reynoldsburg, and we still see remnants of those people today in the Livingston and Graham houses. Mark Myers continues by reading the first-hand account of Mary Durant, whose grandparents took part in the Underground Railroad as conductors, or people who would guide runaway slaves to the next steps on the railroad.
There have been many interesting stories written about the Civil War, and I, Mary, often think of the hardships of my grandparents, Eliza Learn and Ben Patterson, who were married on Christmas Day, 1860, just a few months before the war broke out in April 1861. They lived in a 1-room log house on Main Street in Reynoldsburg, just west of Graham Road. It was there they lived until Grandpa found time to go to the woods and cut the timbers for their new home. Grandpa worked for Mr. Livingston, the tomato seed grower. And when Mr. Livingston became involved with the Underground Railroad, it was then Ben Patterson became the driver of the Ark, as it was called, and would transport the Negro slaves hidden in this wagon to Utica or on to Mount Vernon, where another route was taken to finally reach Canada. My grandmother, who was only 16 when she got married, had to stay all alone in the cabin, always fearful that her husband would be caught. She had no lock on the door, So she used a wooden mush paddle.
Right.
Got it right, didn't I, Connie? A wooden mush paddle, and slipped the handle through two steeples. I'm sorry, that's wrong. You said it is
Staples.
staples, or you've seen them on doors where you can put a bar, it's like a bar, we would use a bar across, push it in there to hold the door securely. Grandma would always worry until he arrived back home in several days. There was no way she could hear from him to learn where his destination was.
Lastly, we wanted to figure out one thing. Why Reynoldsburg? Why was Reynoldsburg the one town so specifically targeted by runaway slaves and the conductors which helped them? Mark Myers continues by telling us much of this was simply because of our geological location in central Ohio.
One of the reasons that Reynoldsburg was on the route was that there was a road, the Underground Railroad. Many of the runaway slaves went up to Columbus. And then from there, it was easy to go down the National Road, to go east on the National Road to transport them. So they went through different places, Whitehall, Hibernia up here by Walnut Creek.
Walnut Creek, yeah. And Main Street and Noe Bixby is where Hibernia was.
Yeah, Main Street, Noe Bixby. They had an abolitionist up there. His name was Williams Noe. And he would send them out this way to Reynoldsburg, and then from there they might go to Granville or directly up to Utica, Mount Vernon, but it was basically that way. And we had abolitionists out here, so that's why we were kind of on the route. So other cities in central Ohio were not necessarily on the Underground Railroad. They were not as conveniently located on the National Road as we were.
We hope you enjoyed our adventure into learning more about the Underground Railroad along with the Reynoldsburg Historical Society. We also hope that you learned a little bit more about the reason our city was so widely used as a stop on the Underground Railroad. These past 3 videos have been a lot of fun to put together, and we want to thank Mark Myers, Connie Parkinson, Mary Stutz, and the rest of the Historical Society for giving us the opportunity to do so. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and check in for content uploaded weekly.